In just May 1942, Sydney Harbour, a working city of steel and tide, and a darkness that wasn't quite honest. Clouds slid across a near-full moon, sketching and erasing silhouettes as three Japanese midget submarines, Ko-Hyoteki, two men each twin 450mm torpedoes, glided for the heads. The plan was a needle-thread slip. The boom ghost past indicator loops, put warheads into the largest hull, preferably the American heavy cruiser, and vanish before anyone knew the water had spoken. But harbors lie in layers. Wires slept on the seabed. Patrol craft idled with depth charges fused as low as the shallows allowed. A net unfinished, mocked still waited with teeth. In the hours when clouds smothered light, stealth felt inevitable. When the moon broke through, wakes flashed like signatures. And where attackers assumed silence, the seabed listened. This is the secret the raiders never truly solved. Allied defense in 1942 didn't depend on a single perfect device. It depended on overlapping imperfections. A twitch on a loop here, a watchman's glimpse there, a depth charge roll that turned water white together enough to break precision. By dawn, one ferry would lie broken men dead in their bunks. And yet the intended prize would steam away angry and unhit. The invisible edge wasn't heroism alone, it was a mesh of signal steel and time. Confidence had momentum. In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ranged far and struck deep Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, an arc of victories that seemed to confirm doctrine audacity plus precision could unbalance empires. Long-range submarines patrolled Australia's coast. Float planes skimmed in to count silhouettes at Garden Island. Reconnaissance found a harbor dense with targets and routine. Sydney looked rich porous, a place that believed big wars lived elsewhere. On paper, the Ko-Hyoteki fit that creed of elegance. 24 meters of compact lethality, batteries humming a low secret, periscope fine as a needle, 2 torpedoes with the reach to amputate a cruiser. The crews were trained for a single clean incision, no lingering, no improvisation, only entry strike exit. Their faith rested on 3 pillars: darkness would conceal, defenders would hesitate, and the harbor's defense's indicator loops, temperamental boom net, incomplete civilian traffic, muddying traces would add up to noise, not threat. They also read Allied culture through a narrow lens. To them, technical sophistication meant precision instruments and decisive craftsmanship. The messy municipal feel of harbor defense watch huts, phone calls, part-time patrol, craft sensors that sometimes lied looked amateur, not layered. The unfinished net was a symbol of complacency, the unreliable loop proof of negligence. If a raid could be lost, it would be lost to a rival's superior blade, not to a quilt of ordinary things stitched together. So the attackers came in with recent triumphs at their back, and a diagram in their heads, a single seam to be found, a single strike to be delivered. They expected a sleeping harbor and a clean geometry of approach angles, ranges, bearings solved under a friendly sky. What they met instead was a living system that didn't need to be perfect to be fatal. When clouds thinned and moonlight returned, that confidence so carefully engineered would start to fray. Not because the enemy had one wonder weapon, but because the enemy had enough. From the attacker's vantage, Allied harbor defense looked like a jumble of half measures, nothing a precision raid couldn't puncture. Indicator loops, noisy, fickle, forever twitching at ferries and tugs. The Japanese dossiers noted weeks of false alarms and watchkeepers who learned to shrug if the wire on the seabed cried wolf every evening rush. Then the wolf could walk through at midnight. ASDIAC/sonar, nearly useless in the chop and reverberation of a crowded, hard-walled harbor. Echoes stacked on echoes until small targets melted into static. Searchlights and barrage fire. Impressive for parades, imprecise for periscopes, light dazzled the defenders as much as the intruder and turned reflections into decoys. They saw the boom net and laughed at the gap's unfinished spans like missing ribs, a gate that could be mistimed piles without chain between them. Doctrine papers suggested that even a complete net could be felt along and nudged aside by a craft small and patient enough. And the patrol boats, converted civilian hulls, under-armed, crewed by men, still memorizing procedures, looked like a token presence. Depth charges, set too deep lest they split piers and shatter windows in the shallows. Machine guns fearsome in daylight, blind at night without a hard silhouette to bite. Over and over, reconnaissance sketched the same complacency. Civilian traffic threaded the lanes long after sunset, painting the loops with meaningless crossings. Work lights flared on the islands. Phones rang through switchboards as if the first battle would be fought by linemen arguing about who should answer. In that picture, the Japanese found confirmation of what they already believed: the Allies were rich, yes, but disorganized. Ingenious, perhaps, but bureaucratic. Brave, but distracted by the very abundance they bragged about. Precision would beat plenty, if the precision arrived in the right hour of darkness. They also misread culture. American and Australian engineers didn't worship the single instrument. They trusted systems. To an eye trained on elegant machines, tight tolerances, polished optics, the Allied habit of layering good enoughs looked sloppy, unworthy of respect. The watchman's eyeball next to an electric loop, next to a netgate log, next to a phone tree, felt like municipal clutter, not military design. The Midget-Sub crews were in effect gamblers who thought the table was rigged in their favor. Too many components meant too many failure modes. Too many human links meant the chain would never pull tight in time. So they chose the needle thread. Enter under cloud while the moon lay veiled and the harbor self-soothed. Slide along the seams, deniable as a porpoise. 2 perfect shots into a fat American hull would do the talking, and by the time the switchboards stopped arguing, the intruders would be gone. The flaw in that logic was subtle, and fatal systems of almost properly stitched don't need to be first, they just need to be fast enough. And fast enough in a living harbor can arrive like a shout after a hush. The Allies' true predicament wasn't a single weak link. It was geometry plus tempo in a harbor that never slept. Sydney was dense with high-value hulls moored in tight water cruisers, depot ships, ferries, converted to barracks. Every movement changed the math angles to target torpedo run-out ricochet risk towards seawalls and sleeping men. Rules of engagement slowed. The first minute's depth charges in the shallows could shatter windows and civilians. Friendly vessels crossed the very lanes where an intruder might hide. Communication lag phones, lamps, sirens could turn seconds into minutes, while watchkeepers argued over whether a loop twitch was a fish, a ferry, or fate. Worse, the sensors lied just often enough to breed doubt. Loops spiked at dusk with commuter wakes, searchlights painted reflections that looked like wakes. ASDIC threw back the harbor itself. A single midget submarine didn't need to be invisible, only confusable among 100 routine traces. The psychology was lethal. Hesitate once, and the geometry closed. A torpedo launched inside Garden Island's embrace could not be outrun. Even a miss might hammer a seawall and turn a barracks ferry into splinters. Courage could not solve that math. Only a fused response could. So the urgent need wasn't a new gun or a bigger net. It was a weaponized process, call it Secret Weapon Y, the Harbor Composite Intercept. Not a gadget. A doctrine encoded in hardware and habit, tripwire thresholds on the indicator loops, pre-agreed spikes that auto-elevated suspicion from note it to scramble, now stripping out the committee phase. Gate discipline on the boom. When the loop tripped, the gate moved on a clock, not a conversation. Shallow fused charges, staged forward pistols, set to burst in 15-25 feet, hand-thrown or rolled safe enough for peers, but savage to a battery-powered hull. Signal choreography searchlights, not as blind probing, but as boxes that framed and froze a patch of water for guns to stitch, while other sectors stayed dark to keep the intruder guessing. Single plotting brain, a cramped room with a grease pencil board, one petty officer owning the picture, vectoring boats by bearing time, marks from loops, lookouts, and any periscope feather reported by voice. This Y looked unimpressive on paper. It looked like discipline at speed, but that was the point. The problem wasn't that the Allies lacked teeth. It was that their bite was unsynchronized. Secret Weapon Y synchronized it. It cut the phone tree dithering, pre-armed the shallow water, and turned a stuttering mosaic into a kill web that could close inside the minute. The cost of not fielding Y was measured in nightmares: a heavy cruiser gutted at anchor, oil burning against the seawall, rescue boats colliding in smoke and echo. The gain from adopting it was measured in denied geometry angles, stolen from the attacker seconds, stolen back by the defender. In a harbor where every wake looked like every other wake, Y made the one that mattered stand out and then vanish under white water. It did not begin with a miracle box, it began with a room. Garden Island. A cramped operations hut that smelled of oilskin and pencil shavings, a wall-sized harbor diagram under grease pencil scars, a telephone switch that clicked like a metronome. If you were expecting a single secret device, the kind that carries a patent number and a sculpted bronze plaque, you would have been disappointed. Technology Y was assembled, not invented. It was secrecy by choreography, innovation by subtraction, a doctrine disguised as furniture. They called it different things, depending on the watch. In one logbook, it's Composite Intercept SOP. In another, just a rectangle drawn around the upper harbour with a note, "When loop twitches, box and close." The spark came from a lieutenant who had lost patience with arguments. He had watched the indicator loops flare at dusk and lull the room to boredom. He had heard the same two questions night after night. Is it a ferry? Is it fish? On paper, the boom net was a barrier. In practice, it was a mouth half open, a gate that needed a decision each time the harbour breathed. Patrol boats circled like sheepdogs without a shepherd's whistle. You could feel the minutes leaking away. So he broke the problem into timed pieces and forbade debate inside the first 90 seconds. If the loop rose above threshold 1, a value pulled from a month of pencil math on typical copper line noise, two things were to happen instantly and without a vote. First, the boom gate would begin its closing sequence on a clock winches whirring whether or not anyone had yet confirmed. Second, a light box would be painted on the water, 3 searchlights, one steady, 2 feathered bracketed a rectangle, not to illuminate the intruder so much as to frame a killing ground for the patrol craft's guns and charges. The lieutenant did not stop at lights and clocks. He built a plotting ritual around the loops that turned subjective feel into coordinates. The loop duty man would mark a time bump with a stubby pencil and call a single number across the room, red spike 5. That meant a pre-agreed millivolt rise sustained for 2 sweeps. A coxswain at a separate desk would lay a bearing time fan from the nearest loop segment toward the most probable track, a cheat that assumed an intruder near the bottom, moving slowly seeking shelter in the ferry lanes. Patrol craft already idling at designated ready points would receive vector calls shouted in plain language, Yoroma steer to the fan slow, Lolita gate cover. No theory, no poetry, just arrows. Then came the wicked part, the thing that made old hands swear and then smile once they saw it work. He staged shallow fused charges forward, pre-wired and placarded for frantic hands, shallow kit, 15 to 25 feet only. Harbour doctrine had long treated depth charges like high explosives you used far from city walls, and they were. But the lieutenant argued that a small cruel geometry was killing them in shoal water. A Midget-Sub could ride under the blanket of safety that defenders created for themselves. To pop the intruder without wrecking windows, you needed short pistols and exclusion arcs sketched in chalk on the deck angles the coxswain would call before the roll thrower, 1 safe, 2 hold 3 safe. Crude, yes. Effective, also yes. Keeping this assembled weapon secret was a different war. You couldn't stamp classified on a room and stop rumors from spreading up and down the coast. So they hid it inside ordinary orders. The loop thresholds were written as housekeeping updates. The lightbox drill appeared as searchlight economy. The gate clock sat under the heading winch maintenance, daily timed test. Even the shallow depth pistols were chalked up to harbour training variations. If a spy read the paperwork, he would find nothing but small bureaucratic tweaks, exactly the kind of thing enemies laugh at. The ingenuity was not only technical, it was human proofing. Operators rotated through chairs, but the ritual stayed fixed. The map swept clean at dawn, went back up every evening, with the same 4 grease lines, ferry lanes boom, throat loop, segments, AC and the kill box. Every watch opened with a 2-minute pantomime. The duty man would spike his own loop with a practice magnet, the plotter would mark, the coxswain would sing out bearings, the lights would run through their rectangle, and a dummy charge would be rolled to the rail and pulled back. Boredom turned to muscle memory. There were failures nights when the loop cried and nothing moved. One evening, when a nervous searchlight painted a ferry's wake and the harbour erupted in curses. Another when a charge rolled too soon and the shock knocked a mug from a shelf. Each mistake went on the wall, literally in red pencil, with a date and a fix. No white paint on the plotting board. It glared under blackout. No phone confirmations before gate start the clock rules. No second guesses inside the first minute, you can argue later. The lieutenant called the wall the hymn book, and when a new man came on watch, he read the hymn book before he touched the loop. That is how Technology Y matured in a room that learned out loud. It was not beautiful, it was not the kind of invention that wins prizes, but it was the kind that wins minutes. And minutes win raids. When the cloud deck began to thin on 31st May and the moon traced quicksilver across the coves, the room was ready clockwork, layered over nerves, a net that finally had a voice and a doctrine that once it started would not stop for anyone's opinion. And one last quiet victory for secrecy. If you had asked a man on that watch what the secret weapon was, he would have pointed to a pencil, or to the wall, or to the clock. He would not have said we invented something. He would have said we stopped arguing. Start at the seabed. Because that's where the room hears. An indicator loop is a buried question made of copper. When steel passes, especially a long conductive hull, the Earth's feeble magnetic field is nudged, and the loop coughs a voltage. Not much millivolts riding on a sea of noise, but enough for a trained operator to trace in pencil as a hill, not a hiccup. The first trick in the source was to stop treating that pencil line as art and start treating it as logic. So they defined threshold 1 and threshold 2 in numbers, not adjectives. Dull evenings of data watching told them the harbor's own heartbeat, Tidestram's distant lightning would twitch the loop to X millivolts. Commuter ferries could push it to X plus. Only a dense, slow metal mass hugging bottom crept into X plus 2 and lingered there in a particular way, a rounded rise, a flat crown, and a sluggish fall. That signature became the tripwire. When the pen traced it, the duty man didn't think he announced. The gate clock began its whine. Meanwhile, up top, light had a job beyond seeing. The light box is not intuitive until you do it once in darkness. One steady beam paints a sector. Two feathered beams angled low, never full glare, frame a rectangle on water. The intruder, if present now, has to cross an edge. You don't need to catch a periscope. You need to catch a wake, change the faint, tight ripple of a small cylinder knifing under the surface. The human eye is poor at absolute detection and excellent at boundary violations. The rectangle turns a formless cove into a stage where any disturbance reads as a cue. Guns point at the box, not at the glare. In early drills, gunners kept chasing reflections. The fix was brutal and elegant guns track the box edge, not the light. If a needle trail cuts the frame, you stitch it. The boom gate in this doctrine is a clock, not a door. The danger with any manual barrier is the human urge to wait for perfect information. The machine steals that urge. When threshold 1 trips, winches engage. The mouth narrows whether or not the intruder exists. If it was a ferry, it will grumble on a telephone and you will open again in 2 minutes. If it was a Midget-Sub, you have just turned an open lane into a funnel which the patrol craft can now rake. The source here is not steel, it is timing. Next layer, bearing time fixing. Classic harbor sonar struggles with reverb. A small, slow target in a box of stone returns a smear. The plotter abandons the quest for a clean ping and instead uses kinematics on scraps, the loop fired at T0. The nearest ready boat makes 7 knots in the first minute of a scramble. The likely intruder speed is 2 to 4 knots hugging the bottom. The ferry lane offers cover here, here, and here. Draw a fan with ages 1 minute, 2, 3, and you will be wrong in detail, but right in shape. Then you deliver vectors in verbs, not angles. Your Roma port quarter of the box, slow Lolita cut the throat of the gate. Steady, steady throw. The whole point is to trade precision you cannot have for speed you must have. Now the part the attackers truly never budgeted for shallow fused charges in city water. Depth charges were designed to break ocean submarines, not surgical ghosts in 12 meters of harbor. The risk is not physics, it is politics, blown windows, angry mayors, court-martials. The engineering workaround looks small and changes everything. You fit short pistols, mechanisms that fire the can at 5 to 8 meters, and you pre-draw exclusion arcs from each thrower position so you never pop under a pier or within a certain angle of a moored hull. That's the chalk the coxswain points to while he counts 1 safe, 2 hold, 3 safe. The blast at shallow depth is violent but local. In tests it turned harbor water to milk and rolled an unmanned skiff without shattering the windows beyond the nearest sheds. In combat it does something else, it hammers batteries. A Midget-Sub, which is mostly battery, and men cannot shrug a near miss in 10 meters. Plates, warp relays, trip crews panic buoyancy shifts. The boat either blows ballast and shows or lies down and drowns. The source has human ingredients, 2 latency killers that sound stupid until you measure them. The loopman's pencil is blunt on purpose. A sharp pencil tempts him to editorialize the wave. Maybe not. The plotting board is matte. No white enamel glare kills eyes. The phone tree collapses to a single switch. The duty man has 3 toggles, gate lights boats, and 1 phrase to the plot. Red spike 5. In practice drills, you are forbidden to say, "Is it a ferry?" before the toggles are thrown. Only after a 60-second burn can the senior watchkeeper lift the handset and start the orchestra of confirmations. By then, your geometry is already better. You might ask, why couldn't the attackers adapt? Why not time the clouds shadow a ferry, say? Idle near the pile light until the box was elsewhere? The answer is that battery war is merciless. A Ko-Hyoteki's useful life in harbor mode is measured in hours, not nights. Every minute of creep is a minute you won't have for the firing solution. Every stop-start to masquerade as a porpoise racks up noise on the loop small but not zero and increases the odds that your signature shape coincides with a watch that has decided to run the clock, not the committee. Worse, once the gate begins to close on schedule, your options narrow to predictable lanes, which are exactly where the box goes. There is also an information asymmetry baked into why. Defenders can be wrong safely, they can close the gate on a ferry paint, a box on empty water roll, one shallow charge that does little but alarm fish. Attackers have no such cushion. A single wrong exposure, one periscope blink in the rectangle, one shimmer on the wrong edge, and the harbour acquires a truth it can act on. That asymmetry is deliberate and cruel. The lieutenant designed Y to be error-tolerant for the defenders and error-intolerant for the intruder. Then there is the moon problem and the cloud. The planners of the raid wagered on overcast to smooth the approach. Y turns that wager into a trap. Under cloud, the loop becomes the primary cue. The box goes up without glare. Guns aim on frame, not shine. If the moon returns, and it often does in brief silver sheets, the box suddenly gains contrast. Wakes that were grey smears become threads of glass. The periscope's meniscus, so careful, becomes a pinprick moving across a ruled notebook. The system is built to profit from phase changes, cloud to moon quiet to engine start, because the clocks don't care. The gate keeps grinding, the boats keep sliding into their lanes, the throwers keep their chalk arcs, the loopman keeps tapping his blunt pencil and calling numbers. Two final knobs round out the source decoys and denial. After drills revealed that intruders might ride the back of a ferry wake, the duty room added shadow boxes, secondary rectangles, staggered behind the big ferries at predictable intervals. Lights tickled the water where a patient midget might be tempted to loiter. Patrol craft ghosted those spots and rolled a single shallow not enough to break anything enough to break nerves. And on nights of special tension, the harbour authority quietly thinned civilian traffic, a few timetable adjustments here, a maintenance delay there, so the loop's canvas was cleaner in the window that mattered. None of this looked like heroism. All of it looked like probability theft. When you stand back, technology Y is unromantic. A threshold, a clock, a rectangle, a fan, a chalk arc, and a rule. No second guesses in the first minute. But add them and you obtain a thing the attackers could not offset in a 3-hour battery war tempo. Adversaries will always find seams. Y narrows them on a schedule faster than a human can narrate an excuse. It is why when cloud thinned and moonlight made a mockery of shadows, the room did not grow wise, it simply grew loud, winches, lamps, telephones, engines, and the flat whoomp of a shallow can turning black water white. The elegance of the raid hit the inelegance of a city. And the city won because its mess had rhythm. That rhythm, invisible on a spy's clipboard, was the secret the intruders never decoded. They had come for a sleeping harbour. They found a metronome. May 1942, Sydney Harbour, 2001. The pen twitches. The duty man doesn't ask what it is. He calls a number, red spike 5, and the room answers like a muscle that's been trained to flex. Somewhere out at the boom gate, winches groan as chain begins to move. Somewhere on the headland, 3 searchlights bud like pale flowers and then rake low, not at the sky, but across the water to draw a bright rectangle. In the hut, the coxswain's pencil rolls a fan from the nearest loop segment toward the ferry lanes and the throat of the gate, 1 minute, 2-3 arcs that look like a child's doodle and act like prophecy. Engines cough on HMAS Yoroma and HMAS Lolita. Throttles come up to a practiced growl. The night is still thick with cloud. What the watch cannot see, the loop insists upon. The line rides up, crowns, lingers too slow for a ferry, too heavy for a porpoise. Something is sliding along bottom contours in a harbour that believes in schedules. The first minute is all choreography. Gate closing, box painted, vectors shouted. Yoroma port edge of the box slow. Lolita hold the throat, depth kits shallow 15 to 25. The men do not argue about fish. The hymn book forbids it. At the pile light, a shape hesitates nothing more than a pause in the tide's handwriting, so slight that in peacetime no one would have named it. Tonight it reads like a flinch. Yoroma eases, keeping the rectangle's left boundary between her bow and the island. The gun crew watches water not glare-trained to see the tight, oily dimple of a periscope feather, the way hunters watch for a deer's ear instead of its body. Lolita shoulders the gate, ready to block a sprint. In the hut, the plot scribbles a New Age mark, and the clock under the boom diagram eats seconds with a tinny whir. 21 to 30. The loop hammers another spike sustained, and the box shifts. Searchlights feather right, the frame walks 100 feet like a sliding stage. Shadow box behind Lady Denman, the coxswain barks. The second team throws light into the wake of a ferry, not because they've seen a sub, but because the doctrine says a patient intruder will try to wear a civilian's coat. The ferry's captain curses at the glare and leans on his horn. The harbour answers with a single shallow charge rolled from Euroma's rail, whoomp, a white blossom that slaps the water flat and drifts it milky. Plates rattle on a nearby barge. In the hut, the duty man glances up, sees nothing new on the loop, and goes back to his blunt pencil. A minute later, there is something new, a rounded rise that does not fall, then a sudden dip as though a weight has shifted. Batteries hate shock. If a Midget-Sub hugged bottom under the ferry's wake, that slap would have buckled, a plate tripped, a relay forced a hand to a valve. The loop doesn't tell a story, it draws a hill with a notch in it. The room narrates anyway. He's hurting, someone says, and the hymn book pinned to the wall in red pencil does not forbid that. 22:30. Cloud thins, the moon sketches the box edge in mercury and makes layers of shadows. The harbour becomes a negative of itself. Dark water silver rules. That is when the intruder tries the oldest trick in the literal book, stillness. He kills motion to become just another lump in the harbour's magnetic breath. It almost works. The loop line smooths out and sinks toward boredom. But the boom gate, indifferent to doubt, keeps closing on schedule, and the geometry the enemy counted on now constricts around him. Lolita noses ahead to the throat. Euroma slides aft toward the pile, the box shrinks like a fist. Somewhere in the narrowed throat, a conning tower breaks the skin just long enough to vent, just long enough to orient. A searchlight's pen grazes it, not a clean hit, only a ripple that doesn't match the wind, 2 inches of wrong in a page of right. The Vickers spits a short bark at the rectangle's edge. Tracers stitch water not to kill, but to mark here for the throwers. 1 safe, 2 hold, 3 safe throw. Another shallow can tumbles heels, the boat pops at 15 feet and hammers the cove like a fist on a drum. That is not what sinks him. What sinks him is the decision not to stop deciding. Just before midnight, M14 or M21, the accounts will argue, fouls the net with her tail. You could call it bad luck, but a net does not need to be complete to be inevitable. It needs time and a little help from a clock. The stern catches mesh and the boat becomes a hooked animal. The loop spikes, then fluctuates, strain patterns a metal fish on a line. Euroma's crew scrambles with grapnels. The coxswain's chalk arcs keep the throwers honest, no cans inside the pier angles. Lolita holds the gate like a bouncer shoulders a door. Permission for heavy charges in the shallow is a phone call that takes too long. The hymn book anticipated that too. A self-destruct thump solves the debate. The trapped crew chooses doctrine of their own scuttle rather than capture, and the harbour shudders with a blunt, close concussion. Windows crack on a shed, a gull lifts and scolds the moon. When the smoke rolls back, the loop line drops to flat. In the plot, someone draws a box around the spike and writes one word, gone. Trial by fire rarely looks like a duel. It looks like a city refusing to be surprised more than once. The room resets to the metronome. The box slides to a new cove. The gate continues to grind. Patrol craft swap lanes like dancers. The watch drinks lukewarm tea. The pencil keeps its round tip. And somewhere beyond the rectangle, another intruder is already threading past moorings toward the American hull that drew this raid like honey draws wasps. Technology Y does not promise omniscience. It promises tempo. Tonight, that is enough to turn elegance into effort and effort into error. By 00:30, Sydney is awake in the particular way a harbour wakes, and telephones carrying rumours along the piers, sentries yelling bearings no one hears, welders standing on catwalks, masks up to watch searchlight rectangles walk across coves like migrating windows. The plot does not care. It marks time, not gossip. It is hunting a pencil-line hill that says metal is moving where metal should not be. The first scoreline is written in white water, not blood. The second will not be so kind. Just after midnight, the cloud lifts as if pulled by a string and the harbour acquires edges. The rectangle over Garden Island shines like a frame scissored from the moon. In that geometry, M24 earns her war story. She slides along the island's lee lines, up a shot at the American heavy cruiser angles, ranges bearings solved in whisper math by men breathing recycled air. Compressed air hisses, a gyroscope whines, 2 450mm torpedoes quit the tubes and lace for glory. The first truth that hits the crew is relief we fired. The second truth arrives a blink later, Geometry doesn't care about bravery. One fish runs long and dies dumb in the dark. The other tracks true until the harbor's hard boundaries turn intent into accident. The seawall takes the blow, shock walks the stones. HMAS Kuttabul, the depot ferry that shelters sleeping men, translates force into splinters. 21 sailors die in their bunks. There is no fairness in that mathematics. There is only the harbor's habit of turning plans sideways. For a few seconds, the attackers own the narrative. A dull boom, a torpedo wake erased by chop, a turn to the gate they hope is still open. But why does not pause for grief or gloat? The loop picks up the long steel hiccup of torpedoes having passed. Then it gulps a heavier, slower signature battery hull creeping for the throat. The box slides, guns settle, the coxswain's chalk hand lands on thrower, 2 hold 3, safe one safe throw. A shallow can pops not on top of the sub, but where he must transit if he keeps this speed. You don't have to catch him, you have to force him to move wrong. Inside M24, men try to be mathematics. They trim, they correct, they aim their tiny boat for the seam that used to be there. But the gate is no longer an opinion. It is schedule-made metal. The throat narrows into a funnel of glare and tracer that doesn't need to hit to hurt. A periscope meniscus breaks searching for silence and finding rules rectangles that bleed light along their edges, engine notes that refuse to be random, the same boat waiting in the same lane every time a pencil in a hut says now. Panic is a physical thing. It shortens breath, thickens fingers, bends time. On the intruder's clock, battery minutes turn to seconds, and every correction eats the very fuel of secrecy. The crew came to a sleeping harbour. They now feel pursued by something that doesn't chase, only arrives, lights already on gate, already moving cans, already set shallow. The realization is not a sentence formed in the head. It is an exhaustion in the arms as the boat refuses to answer as crisply as during drills, an ache in the jaw from clenching against their own charges. The harbour, cruel in its indifference, gives them one gift and one curse. The gift, a sliver of shadow as a ferry's bulk masks the box. The curse, shadow boxes, those staggered rectangles laid behind predictable wakes. A single shallow pop detonates in the ferry's echo, not close enough to kill, close enough to scramble balance. The intruder nosedives a breath too far, scrapes, rises, the loop draws a notch in its hill. In the hut, a petty officer smiles without mirth. He has seen this notch in drills. He's light, he says, meaning a ballast change, and the coxswain steers a boat to where light must go. Realization on the Axis side is cumulative. First, the anti-submarine net unfinished still manages to steal options. Second, indicator loops unreliable are reliable enough when married to a clock. Third, patrol craft with civilian bones and shallow charges do not need a perfect range card. They need lanes and rules. The attackers have trained to defeat precision. They are being unmade by overlap. By 0130, the raid's narrative has inverted. The Allied machine is no longer reacting, it is predicting. Every time the intruder slips left, a light is already feathering that edge. Every time he checks depth, a can rolls to greet the depth he will choose. The harbour seems to know where he isn't allowed to be yet and builds barriers there before he arrives. That sensation, the enemy pre-scheduling your mistakes, is what men remember in memoirs. It is the opposite of duel. It is suffocation by tempo. The moment of panic that commanders write about does not look like screaming. It looks like a small boat taking a suboptimal shot at the gate because the clock has eaten all other shots. It looks like a periscope eyepiece that will not stay dry. It looks like one officer reaching for a lever at the exact instant the hull picks up a shallow blast and every needle on a panel trembles as if sharing a thought. It is the recognition that the plan has no later left in it. Somewhere north of the main drama, white wakes cross in illustration of a broader truth. A different Midget-Sub, already broken by earlier cans and boxed by stones and boats, chooses scuttling over capture. Another will simply vanish beyond the heads and not be found until divers spend a lifetime and a bureaucracy's patience looking. The raid's ledger grows messy, brave acts, bad luck, reactive grace notes. But the lesson that crystallizes in the attacker's chest is simple enough to taste. We are not beating a wall. We are drowning in a tide. Dawn edits everything. Smoke has a way of rewriting nights, and the Kuttabul wreck stains the water with the cost of learning. The American cruiser, untouched, furious, has already left for open sea. Patrol craft looks suddenly small against a sky that pretends there was nothing to be afraid of. The hut exhales. Men become talkers again. Phones stop being weapons and return to being arguments. But the attackers who survived do not remember the harbour as a place of men. They remember it as a rhythm that would not change for them. That is the realization worth carrying home. If home is reachable on a diesel that smells like penance, the Allies did not need a wonderbox. They needed a way to enforce time. The secret weapon was not a signal, a bomb, or a net with perfect coverage. It was the decision that the first minute belonged to the clock, not to doubt. Once the defenders taught themselves to move, before they finished believing the raid was living on borrowed breath. The shock in the Axis telling is not that Sydney had defences. It is that Sydney's imperfections agreed on when to act. In wars that are decided by factories, that lesson reads small. In a harbour fought at walking speed under a silvered sky, it reads like destiny. The ledger the morning after looked ambiguous. A depot ferry lost 21 sailors dead, one intruder apparently escaped, 2 destroyed or scuttled. But why the harbour composite intercept was never about a single night's arithmetic. Its effect was strategic metabolism. Once a port learns to move on a clock instead of a committee, it does not unlearn it. Sydney tightened everything that could be tightened: gate discipline, formalized loop thresholds, standardized across watches, shallow fused kits issued as normal stores, lightbox drills written into the evening ritual. The doctrine traveled quietly up and down the coast. Other harbors borrowed the metronome. For the enemy, this was lethal in a way that figures rarely capture. The Axis undersea strategy in distant waters relied on narrow windows, short battery endurance in littoral raids, limited torpedo stocks, and the hope that confusion would yield the decisive minute. Why cancelled confusion as a weapon? It turned imperfect sensors into probabilistic dominance, making small raids pay an increasing tax in time and options. The half-finished boom now behaved like a finished one because it moved when the loop twitched. The unreliable indicator loops became reliable enough when their output auto-triggered procedures. Patrol craft that once milled the water became lane owners who did not need perfect contacts to deny geometry. Strategically, that denial rippled outward. If a precision knife cannot cut harbors, it must waste itself on sea lanes. If it wastes itself on sea lanes, Allied production convoys, repair cycles, fuel schedules, regains rhythm. This is how small coastal doctrine strengthens a global war machine. It protects time, which protects throughput, which protects campaigns. In that sense, why helped convert a daring Japanese concept, Midget-Sub infiltration under cloud, into an obsolete idea. Not because the craft were unbrave or the crews unskilled, but because the defense stopped needing to be right first. It only needed to be right soon. By late 1942, the lesson had settled like silt raids that depended on elegant surprise, could bleed prestige, could draw headlines, could kill men, but they could not reprogram Allied tempo. The machine rolled because ports that once hesitated now answered themselves, and strategy written around moments cannot survive against an enemy that manufactures minutes. History likes clean quotations. War leaves crooked ones. After the war, Japanese naval officers and engineers wrote and spoke with a candor they could not afford in 1942. The theme is consistent even when the phrasing shifts. They had underestimated the power of layered ordinary defenses run on procedure. One staff officer reflecting on coastal operations put it this way in paraphrase: "Our boats went to defeat not for lack of courage or design, but because the enemy taught their harbors to act faster than we could think." Another engineer describing harbor sensors he once dismissed as municipal gadgets conceded that the combination loops, lights, gates, patrol craft stole our minutes, and that minutes, not meters, decide the fate of battery boats. Take whichever variant you prefer. They rhyme. The final word is not a flourish about superior genius. It is an admission about discipline that the Allies' secret was not a single hidden box, but a way of making imperfect tools agree on time. In a war where the Axis often prized precision and elegance, they met an adversary who prized throughput and overlap. And on nights like Sydney, cloud thinning to moon rectangles, walking the coves, blunt pencils, calling numbers that philosophy became a physics, the raiders could feel in their bones. If you demand a single sentence to close the ledger, let it be this, rendered fairly from the post-war tone of those who knew both courage and loss. We planned to slip past defenses. We did not plan for a harbour that moved on a clock. That was our miscalculation, and it made our craft and our idea obsolete.